Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, July 14th, 2023. U.S. House of Representatives passes a defense programs and policy bill that includes amendments targeting the Pentagon's policies on abortion access, transgender care, diversity programs, and addressing climate change. The House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, a Republican, tweeting, "Our military should be focused on protecting America, not pushing the left's woke ideology." And from the House Minority Whip Catherine Clark, a Democrat, this tweet, Speaker Kevin McCarthy has transformed a bipartisan bill into an extremist manifesto. The GOP has chosen MAGA over our military. We'll have much more reaction in just a moment. Also today, the National Governors Association incoming chair, Utah's Spencer Cox, a Republican, at the NGA annual meeting in New Jersey, talks about his chair initiative called Disagree Better, aimed at reducing partisan polarization on controversial issues. He says the goal is to disagree, even strongly, but not hate each other so much that it gets in the way of finding a compromise. Vice President Kamala Harris in Maryland announcing investments in clean energy, the final stop on what the Biden administration has promoted as its Investing in America tour. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Dick Durbin, a Democrat, previews next week's markup of a bill to require the Supreme Court adopt an ethical code of conduct. And we'll talk with political reporter Daniela Diaz about the Senate Democrats' new demographic survey of their office staff on how they identify when it comes to race, ethnicity, and LGBTQ. CBS News reporting the House on Friday narrowly approved the must-pass defense policy bill, ending uncertainty about its fate after Republicans pushed through a series of conservative policy amendments on abortion, diversity, equity and inclusion programs, and gender transition procedures. The annual National Defense Authorization Act, which sets policy for the Defense Department, cleared the House in a near-party line vote, 219 to 210. 4 Republicans voted against the bill, while 4 Democrats voted for it, support that rescued the defense measure from failure. That's from CBS News. The House Speaker Kevin McCarthy held a news conference after passage.
I'm sorry to disappoint you that Republicans continue to keep our promises, and we just, again, from all your questions all week long, will the NDAA pass this week? Not many of you ever asked me about the policy, so I want to spend some moment. Your first question, yes, it passed. Now let's actually get through to what we promised the American public what we'd do. I first want to start thanking Chairman Rogers and all the members of the Armed Services Committee for the work they did. I'm grateful for their leadership on this important issue. House Republicans have made a commitment to America that we would fight for a nation that is safe. Today, we kept that promise by passing the National Defense Authorization Act. Under this bill, men and women in uniform who make sacrifices for our nation every day will receive the biggest pay raise in decades. We all know they deserve it. Radical programs that have forced our troops at the expense of readiness are now eliminated. Cutting-edge technology that is essential for the future of this country and to keep freedom around the world in the rise of China and Russia will receive more investment than we've watched in the past. And taxpayers will save more than $40 billion as this bill roots out wasteful spending. The real question that you never asked me that I wish you would, why did the Democrats vote no? Technically, it's a bipartisan vote, but 4 Democrats vote with us. Are the rest of the Democrats against a pay raise for their veterans? Are they against deterring China for a safe future? Are they against rooting out wasteful spending? Because they all voted against it today. They can claim a lot of things. But the biggest issue they claim why they voted against, they voted for just last year. It's a good thing that Republicans are in the majority, but it's more important that we keep our promises to America and to our men and women who serve to defend us. And today is exactly what we did.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, with other House Republicans at a news conference in the U.S. Capitol building after the House passed the Defense Policy and Programs Bill for fiscal year 2024. Again, the vote 219 to 210, almost all party line. There were 4 Republican no votes. Andy Biggs of Arizona, Ken Buck of Colorado, Eli Crane of Arizona, and Thomas Massie from Kentucky. And 4 Democrats voted yes: Don Davis of North Carolina, Jared Golden of Maine, Marie Gluesenkamp Perez from Washington State, and Gabe Vasquez from New Mexico. More from Speaker McCarthy's news conference. He was asked by a reporter if adding the amendments on abortion, gender-affirming care, and diversity will make it more difficult to get a final bill that can pass the Democratic-controlled Senate and be signed into law by a Democratic president.
One, how do you reconcile that the Senate product will be different and that it will be difficult, if not impossible, to have the culture war amendments in the conference version, and the second, ball's down in the Democrat-led Senate's hands? What message is the House sending to the Senate with this bill?
Just focus on the military. Stop using taxpayer money to do their own wokeism. A military cannot defend themselves if you train them in woke. We don't want Disneyland to train our military. We want our men and women in the military to have every defense possible, and that's what our bill does. The money focuses directly on their quality of life and, more importantly, on the investment. When you sit and look, and the whole concept of where I came up with the Select Committee on China was walking the graves of Normandy. As I walked those graves, I looked at those names. They were all about the same age. They came from different faith, from a Star of David to crosses. They all died at the same time. And I thought, as a policymaker, because I walked right next to then at the time Speaker Pelosi, and I wondered, what could those policymakers have done that that day would have never happened? First and foremost, you put your politics aside and you focus on the military so war never becomes. That's what we did today in the NDAA. What the Democrats did was put their politics before the men and women who serve. They said no to a pay raise. They said no to an investment that sent the wrong message to our adversaries around the world. Having a different bill in the Senate, you can ask me that on any bill that comes out of the floor. And you know what? I hope the bills that come out of the House are different than the bills that come out of that Schumer's in charge of. And you know what? We designed our government to be this way, because then we go to conference and we find where we can unite. There was a bipartisan vote on here, but the majority of Democrats decided to vote against giving our military a pay raise. And I think that's wrong.
Speaker Kevin McCarthy at his news conference in the U.S. Capitol building. Washington Post writes that the NDAA, which sets Pentagon policy and spending limits for the year ahead, includes increased investment in precision missiles, warships, and newer technologies like artificial intelligence and hypersonics, necessities leading lawmakers and the Biden administration say, as the U.S. directs greater attention toward China. It also authorizes a 5.2% base pay increase for military personnel and expanded support for their families through housing improvements and broader access to child care, health care, and education benefits. That from the Washington Post. Total authorization for FY 2024 is $886 billion. But it was mostly those amendments on abortion and other social issues which were added to the bill that led to the vast majority of Democrats voting no. The House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, spoke about it at his news conference today.
Our view of the National Defense Authorization Act is that it is woefully irresponsible that extreme MAGA Republicans have hijacked a bipartisan bill that is essential to our national security and taken it over and weaponized it in order to jam their extreme right-wing ideology down the throats of the American people. That's why they've used the National Defense Authorization Act to continue their march toward a nationwide ban on abortion care and applying it to women service members and military spouses. That's outrageous, and it undermines our national security because we have an all-volunteer military. That means, as President Truman first recognized in 1948, when he desegregated the military, that in an increasingly diverse society, you have to have all hands on deck. Every corner of society should feel welcome in the military. We have to recruit from every segment of society in order to make sure that we're prepared in an increasingly dangerous world. And the good news is that every corner of American society, from communities of color, from women, from members of the LGBTQ plus community, have stepped up to say, we want to serve. We want to protect and defend all that America is about. That's why we have an incredibly diverse military, and it's good for the nation. But these extreme MAGA Republicans have decided that we want to attack women who serve in the military. We want to attack communities of color who are disproportionately overrepresented in military service. And we want to attack members of the LGBTQ plus community. This is incredibly irresponsible in terms of our national security. And that's why I'm going to strongly oppose this hyper-partisan, extreme, right-wing effort to undermine our national security.
House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries at a news conference. It was a block of conservative House Republicans, many part of the Freedom Caucus, that pushed to allow the amendments on abortion and other controversial issues to come up for vote. And when they did, they passed and were added to the bill. Congressman Scott Perry, Republican from Pennsylvania, chairs the Freedom Caucus. He spoke at his own news conference.
We're here to talk about the gains that were made in the National Defense Authorization Act through the continuous, persistent, and principled, relentless efforts of America's House Freedom Caucus and other members of the conference to improve the bill and stop the Biden administration's injection of politics and wokeness into the military. Saw a very major win for the American people and against the Biden administration in Representative Jackson's amendment being passed that upholds the value of life, and we think that is meaningful. We also are wanting to recognize and acknowledge the tremendous courage of Senator Tuberville and his efforts, and to let him know that while he's been leading the charge, reinforcements are right here in the House, and the rest of the Senate should be motivated to help him in that effort as well. And to finally let you know that the House Freedom Caucus, America's Freedom Caucus, is never going to stop to making every single bill that gets out of here as the best it can be, the most righteous it can be, and the best for America. And surrounded with me are great members of the Freedom Caucus that are going to talk about some of the things that have happened in this bill and our efforts to move forward.
Congressman Scott Perry, Republican from Pennsylvania, Freedom Caucus chair, with other caucus members at a news conference right before passage today of the Defense Policy and Programs Bill. From NBC News, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, who said Thursday night that she would oppose the bill, voted yes on Friday, saying the reason for her change of heart was that Speaker Kevin McCarthy promised her a seat on the conference committee that will hash out the differences between the House and Senate versions of the bill. Congresswoman Greene, who is opposed to additional funding for Ukraine, said her goal in the conference committee will be to convince her colleagues that if more money for the war-torn country should be offered, it should be part of a separate supplemental funding package. That's from NBC News. There were several amendments to the defense bill to limit or eliminate military aid to Ukraine offered over the last 2 days, none getting a majority, so they're not part of the final bill. Congresswoman Greene spoke to reporters on the U.S. Capitol West Front about her yes vote on final passage today in exchange for that conference committee seat.
It was something I thought a lot about. I spoke with the speaker, and he asked me if I would be part of the conference with the Senate. And in doing so, that allows me to go and be a voice in the room to talk about removing the money going to Ukraine, to talk about the importance that our Department of Defense's mission is to deter war and protect our nation's national security. And I'm very excited to be able to do that. Another thing I get to do is talk about the importance of keeping the Hyde Amendment in the NDAA and making sure that there's no money for transgender surgeries. That just doesn't belong in the military. But also to be able to make sure that we keep in all the good things that we did with the NDAA, the pay increases, the benefits for health care, and so many of the policy changes, getting rid of DEI, getting rid of all these woke policies and language in the NDAA. And I'm excited to have that opportunity. And of course, I made it very clear that obviously this is not final passage, but on final passage, my red line is money to fund and fuel a war that doesn't make sense. I think our policy here should be urging both sides to get to a peace agreement, and money going to Ukraine doesn't belong in our national Department of Defense.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, with reporters today on her yes vote on the defense authorization bill. She offered a few amendments to the bill, as she referenced. One was dealing with limiting military aid to Ukraine. About another of her amendments, the Hill newspaper writes that nearly 50 House Democrats snubbed President Biden by voting for an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act Thursday that would have sought to block his move to provide cluster munitions to Ukraine. The amendment, led by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, failed in a House floor vote of 147 to 276, with support from 49 Democrats and 98 Republicans. That from the Hill. The NDAA was reported from the House Armed Services Committee on a nearly unanimous vote, 58-1. But in the full House, almost every Democrat voted no. The committee's ranking Democrat, Adam Smith of Washington State, spoke on the House floor right before the vote today about those amendments sponsored by the Freedom Caucus members that made it into the bill.
And now I will, I think, slightly paraphrase a line from A Few Good Men. Basically, all this bill does is weakens our country. It weakens our ability to respect all of the people who should be allowed to serve, not just to serve, but to serve with an equal chance at advancement. Whether you're talking about women, whether you're talking about trans people, whether you're talking about people of color, this bill says that we're going to make it more difficult for you to get a fair shake in the military. And I do understand the DEI argument. But let me just say two things about that as I bring this to a close. First of all, there were a lot of very disturbing arguments made. I think the base renaming commission argument, even though technically it really didn't matter, was the most disturbing at all. As we once again heard all these speeches about how, we need to honor our history and honor our heritage. The exact same arguments that were made over 100 years ago when this country went through a very concerted effort to make sure that we could establish white supremacy as the law of the land. The very same arguments that erected these monuments and named these bases and gave us the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow were made on the floor of this House. Now, it's shocking that those arguments were made. It is appalling that those arguments carried the day and actually won on all of these amendments and found themselves inserted in the bill. So all of that is very concerning. I do understand that there is a different set of arguments, and a very respectable set of arguments, that says that the way we are attempting to address the historical discrimination in this country is problematic. And that is primarily critical race theory. And there are certainly some in this country who have a view of this, that our country is nothing but racist. And that basically, and we've heard, I think Mike Waltz actually read this out in committee, and it's very accurate. There are some who believe that all white people are racists, that if you're a white person, you are by definition an oppressor, and you need to think about that. I've seen that. I've witnessed that. It's wrong, okay? In my opinion, it is not the correct way to approach that. So how should we handle that? Well, the way we have chosen to handle that is to get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion completely and totally. And that's the problem.
Congressman Adam Smith, Democrat from Washington State, Armed Services Committee ranking member, on the House floor right before final passage of the NDAA. And with the bill passing today, again the vote 219 to 210, it goes to the Senate, which will begin work on its version next week. And one amendment expected in the Senate is going to make some news. The Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat, and Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican, want to create a commission with authority to declassify government documents about UFOs, or UAPs as they're known today, unidentified aerial phenomena. You're listening to Washington Today. The new chair of the National Governors Association, Republican Spencer Cox, is calling on Americans to reduce partisan polarization in his new NGA chair initiative named Disagree Better. Governor Cox spoke about it at the NGA annual meeting in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Governor Cox will be referring to Jared, that's the new NGA vice chair, Governor Jared Polis, Democrat from Colorado, and Phil, who is the outgoing NGA chair, Governor Phil Murphy, Democrat from New Jersey.
Our nation was founded on profound disagreement, healthy disagreement. I want us to disagree. Jared and I are going to disagree on lots of things. Okay? Phil and I disagree on lots of policy issues. But there's a right way to do that and a wrong way to do it. We can disagree without hating each other. We can look to build others and not tear each other down. There is a power in proximity. One of the reasons the National Governors Association works is because we spend time together and we get to know each other as human beings first and as politicians second. And we need more of that in our country today. Now, the other thing that I think is important, this is not just a feel-good thing that we're trying to do. There's actual science behind this. We've been working very closely with groups across the country. We've been working closely with Stanford and Dartmouth and others in their policy labs who have been running experiments on us, trying to learn the science behind depolarization. And you're going to hear more about some of that today. One of the things that they found that worked, and this is part of our initiative, we're going to ask governors all across the country to join us in filming a video, if they will, at least an op-ed, if they can't do that, with someone on the other side of the aisle, another governor, a mayor, a member of Congress, someone you respect in your state or elsewhere who is of the opposing party, to show Americans, see, there's a permission structure in culture, right? And politics is always downstream of culture. We're trying to help culture improve, and we can do that. What they found is that as we do this permission structure, politicians have been giving Americans permission to hate each other. It's up to us to give Americans permission to care for each other again. And that's what we're trying to accomplish. And this is one way we can do it.
The new NGA chair, Governor Spencer Cox, Republican from Utah, at the NGA winter meeting in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He said he'll be promoting this new initiative, Disagree Better, with debates, service projects, public service announcements, and other strategies to promote civil discourse about contentious issues. The Biden administration's 4-month promotion of its economic agenda that it calls the Investing in America Tour concluded today with Vice President Kamala Harris in Baltimore, Maryland. The tour has featured President Biden, the Vice President, cabinet secretaries, and other top officials around the country, highlighting provisions of spending bills the president has signed designed to address climate change and create jobs.
For years, one of the missing pieces in our strategy to fight the climate crisis is that we have not invested at scale in community climate action. For years, the people of the community, folks who know what their neighborhood needs and how to provide it, have not been given adequate resources to implement climate solutions that match the magnitude of the crisis we face. And that's why we're here today. Today, I am proud to announce the largest investment in financing for community-based climate projects in our nation's history. It's a good day. And one of the reasons that it is so significant is because we also, frankly, we got to make up for some lost time. So by dramatically accelerating our work, we know we can lower emissions. And we will do that by providing $20 billion to a national network of nonprofits, community lenders, and other financial institutions to fund tens of thousands of climate and clean energy projects across America.
Vice President Kamala Harris at Coppin State University in Baltimore, Maryland. On Wall Street, the Dow up 113, S&P down 4, NASDAQ down 24. Education Department announcing $39 billion in student debt relief for 804,000 borrowers as part of an income-based repayment plan program in which the federal government cancels remaining balances for the borrower after they've made payments for 20 or 25 years. The Senate Judiciary Committee plans to take up legislation next Thursday to require the Supreme Court adopt an ethical code of conduct. This comes after many news articles in recent weeks raising questions about justices accepting free trips or putting pressure on institutions to buy their books. Yesterday, the committee chair Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, previewed the markup session in an interview with Washington Post Leanne Caldwell.
The bottom line is this: they should adopt the same code of ethics as every other federal judge in America. Those 9 members of the Supreme Court are being treated differently. In fact, they're being exempt from requirements that face members of Congress and other federal judges. And the disclosures that come out recently, lavish gifts and circumstances that are hard to explain involving these justices, really compel us to do something for the sake of the court. My initial reaction was to turn to the Chief Justice and say, please move on this now. I approached him with this subject for the first time 11 years ago. He said he wasn't going to do anything. I thought with these latest disclosures, he might change his mind. So I reached out to him in writing and said, will you appear before our committee or work toward the goal of coming up with a standard? He's basically refused. He said, whatever the rules and laws are now, that's all that we need. But I think most Americans would disagree.
And of course, this latest push comes after you mentioned a spate of new reports about trips, gifts from some of the justices, including Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. But Republicans say that it is not Congress's job to dictate how the Supreme Court operates. Is this legislative overreach?
No, it's not. And let me tell you, I think our role in this situation, Congress's role in this situation, is very clear. We are not trying to influence the decision-making on any case. That is clearly the responsibility and the constitutional right of the Supreme Court under Constitution as written. But in terms of the administration of the Supreme Court, Congress has responsibilities that include something as basic as choosing the number of justices. You have to go back to 1869. We decided there would be 9 Supreme Court justices, done by statute. That number is held for so many years, but it was a congressional decision. When it comes to funding the Supreme Court or the basic rules of conduct, we had that authority over history, and I think we still do. Let me also add that last year we had a bipartisan bill by Senators Cornyn and Coons related to stock ownership and decisions by federal courts involving defendants or plaintiffs who represented the stock ownership. Judges were asked to recuse themselves from cases where there were conflicts of interest. It was passed on a bipartisan basis in the Congress. It was sent to the Supreme Court and all the other federal courts, and they abided by it. They said, we're going to live by that standard. So it's not a radical idea that Congress comes up with an ethical standard and the court follows it.
Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, Judiciary Committee Chair, and Leanne Caldwell, co-author of the Early 202 and anchor of Washington Post Live, a virtual discussion hosted by the Washington Post. The committee markup of the Supreme Court Ethical Code of Conduct bill is scheduled for next Thursday, July 20th, 9:30 a.m. Eastern. C-SPAN will be covering it. And Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you find your podcast and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. A story from Reuters out of Jakarta, Indonesia. Russia shows no sign of changing direction in its war with Ukraine, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Friday, as foreign ministers from 24 countries met in Indonesia's capital for the Southeast Asia's annual security-focused gathering. Top diplomats from China, the United States, and Russia were among those who traveled to Jakarta for the ASEAN Regional Forum, where broad-based agendas are typically hijacked by geopolitical flare-ups. That's how Reuters put it. Here is Secretary Blinken at a news conference asked whether he had any interaction with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
I think it's fair to say that based on what we heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov today, his interventions and engagements were not constructive or productive on any issue. He focused, unlike the United States and unlike many other countries, on a totally negative presentation and agenda in which he effectively ascribed every problem in the world to the United States. We were resolutely focused on the affirmative agenda that we have with ASEAN, including many of the issues that I've already had an opportunity to discuss. But I'll leave it to you to see how others heard that. But I think there was a very stark difference in the focus that we brought to this affirmative agenda and this shared vision for the future of the region, and what we heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Indonesia. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which has 10 countries in it. Secretary Blinken also asked about his meetings with China's highest-ranking diplomat, Wang Yi, who leads the Communist Party's Central Commission for Foreign Affairs, and the news that the State Department and Microsoft made this week that hackers, Microsoft says the hackers are from China, accessed email from 24 organizations, including U.S. government agencies.
We'll first go to Abigail Williams with NBC News.
Thanks so much. Mr. Secretary,
Abby?
What was your message to Director Wang about the recent attack on State Department and Commerce email accounts? Was your own account targeted, or were those of other senior officials at the State Department? And what consequences will Beijing face? And if I may, one more, what progress has been made on the cases of wrongfully detained Americans, Mark Spadong, Kylie, and David Lynn?
Thank you. Let me start with the second part of the question first. As always, when we engage with our Chinese counterparts, we are raising and working on the cases of detained Americans, and we did so again yesterday. This is something we're working on. It was a subject of some discussion when I was in Beijing as well, and we will continue to work on that until we succeed in bringing people home. With regard to the cyber incident that you referenced, here's what I can tell you. First of all, this is something that the State Department actually detected last month, and we took immediate steps to protect our systems, to report the incident, in this case notifying company Microsoft of the event. I can't discuss details of our response beyond that, and most critically, this incident remains under investigation. As a general matter, we have consistently made clear to China, as well as to other countries, that any action that targets the U.S. government or U.S. companies, American citizens, is of deep concern to us, and we will take appropriate action in response.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Jakarta, Indonesia. The French national anthem played at the annual Bastille Day military parade in Paris. The celebrations marking the anniversary of the French Revolution in 1789. Associated Press writes that the parade this year comes with more than 100,000 police deployed around the country to prevent a new outbreak of unrest in underprivileged neighborhoods following the fatal police shooting of a teenager with North African roots that laid bare anger over entrenched inequality and racial discrimination. Again, that's from AP. France often invites foreign leaders to the Bastille Day parade, and this year, the honored guest was India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. And the U.S. Embassy in France tweeting in French, the entire embassy team wishes the French people a happy National Day. U.S. Senate Democratic offices have released new data on how their staff self-identify when it comes to race, ethnicity, and LGBTQ+. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, spoke on the Senate floor on Thursday about this year's survey.
Mr. President, this morning the Democratic Senate Diversity Initiative released the results of its annual survey of Democratic staffers, the 7th year they have done so in a row. When I became Majority Leader, I promised to work to increase the diversity of Senate offices so that they can reflect the diversity of the states and the communities in which we serve. This year's survey shows that we continue to make important progress, and I want to highlight a few of the results. For the 4th year in a row, the number of diverse staffers has increased, reaching the highest level since we launched our survey, and almost certainly the highest level ever. Certainly the highest level in our conference's history. Our survey also shows that more African Americans work for Senate Democratic offices than ever, and in fact that's also true for Latinos, Middle Eastern and North Africans, and Asian American Pacific Islanders. Additionally, more staffers identify as part of the LGBTQ community since we first asked that question starting in 2019. These milestones matter. Diversity matters. Our democracy can only thrive when all voices are heard and represented. I've seen that in my own office. I learn more and more from people of diverse backgrounds. It's a great thing, and it helps me be a better senator for all the people of New York State. And I believe our survey matters too, because the only way we can make progress is by holding ourselves accountable through transparency. To say we're doing it is not enough. To actually do it and have the statistics and numbers that show we're doing it shows the real progress we're making. Now, we have a lot of work left to do. We're not there yet, no, that's for sure. But I'm encouraged that our caucus continues to grow more diverse with each passing year.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor on Thursday. More on the Senate Democratic Diversity Initiative's annual diversity survey. On the phone now is Daniela Diaz, congressional reporter for Politico. Thanks for being with us. What did this year's survey find?
You know, I think probably the most prominent information that came out of this survey, which, by the way, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has been doing for 7 years now. This is the 7th he's actually put out of Democratic Senate staff, was that the amount of staffers that are Latino has increased by 67% since the first survey. And currently 15% of staffers identify as Latino that work in Senate Democratic offices. I found that to be quite interesting, maybe because I'm a Latina reporter, but also just really shows how the offices are diversifying. And it seems that they made a push to try to bring more diversity into several different Democratic offices. And it seems like that push is working.
You said this was started 7 years ago. Why was it started?
You know, I think it was part of a push from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to just increase the diversity overall of the Senate. Not only has the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, you know, that committee that's in charge of recruiting people to run for Senate and win to keep the Democratic majority in the Senate, they try to recruit diverse candidates, but also have diverse staff working for them. It's interesting because we actually haven't seen any sort of survey come from the Republican side. Senate Republicans don't survey staff and ask them questions about their backgrounds. So we really only have an idea of what it looks like for who's working for Democratic staff, but it seems like it was part of a push from the office to just increase the diversity in the office, because it is true that they really do believe that increasing diversity helps with representing the country. You know, the people that work on Capitol Hill serve their constituents, and the people that work on Capitol Hill should reflect that.
Do all Senate Democratic offices participate in this?
They do. It's really interesting. So we actually have, you know, data from all the offices. And of course, it's no surprise if you're a black senator, you have, you know, more black staffers than if you're a white senator. You know, we found that Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii actually has the most racially and ethnically diverse staff. She actually has 71% of her staff as non-white. That's how they identify. And 56% identify as Asian American, Pacific Islander. And that's interesting because, of course, Senator Mazie Hirono herself identifies that way. So it's reflective of who she is and her staff. And no surprise here, the lowest diversity office with the least amount of diversity or people who identify as non-white is Senator Joe Manchin's office, probably reflective of his own constituents in West Virginia. He's maintained the multi-year streak of having the least racially diverse staff in the caucus, with only 12% of aides identifying as non-Caucasian, but it is up from recent years by 7%. So even his office has diversified lately. So really interesting to see that those numbers coming from them.
We're talking with Daniela Diaz from Politico. There's also a category for LGBTQ. What did the numbers show there?
That was also really interesting. 16% of staffers identify as LGBTQ+, and that number has grown each year since the question was first introduced in 2019. So it actually wasn't even part of the original questions in the survey that the majority leader sends to all the Senate Democratic offices, but since it was introduced, it has increased. It could be maybe also just because of a sign of the times of more people identifying as LGBTQ+, but really interesting that 16% identify as that.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that progress is being made, but we're not there yet. Has he laid out any goals for what diversity should be for Senate staff?
Not specifically, but it's definitely something we've heard from him time and time again. And again, I do want to emphasize, it's not really just the Senate staff that they're really trying to recruit diversity with, but of course, even some of the candidates that we're seeing run in the 2024 elections for Senate, they really want to see a more diverse Senate reflecting people that live in the United States. And they are making a very clear push for that and have continued to do so.
Daniela Diaz, congressional reporter for Politico. You can find her stories at politico.com and on Twitter at Daniela Micaela. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word, to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.